The Last Goodbye. A Dog's Final Promise. The old clock in the hallway struck midnight, its echo bouncing off the wooden walls of the small countryside home. Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her fingers gripping the blanket tightly. The night was eerily silent, too silent. Even the crickets had stopped their usual chorus. Then it happened, a faint scratching sound. At first, Sarah thought it was her imagination, maybe a branch against the window. The wind had been strong earlier, but as she held her breath, the noise returned, a slow, deliberate scratching, just outside her bedroom door. Her heart pounded in her chest. Then, a soft whimper. Sarah bolted, upright. "Buddy!" she whispered. She hesitated before swinging her legs over the bed and tiptoeing toward the door. The wooden floor creaked under her weight. With a shaky hand, she turned the knob. The door opened with a slow creak, revealing the dimly lit hallway. Buddy, her old golden retriever, stood there, his fur damp and matted, his chest rising and falling heavily. His deep brown eyes, once filled with boundless energy, now held something. Else, urgency. "Buddy, what's wrong?" Sarah knelt, running a hand through his fur. His body trembled beneath her touch. He turned, padding toward the front door, then looked back at her as if asking, no, begging her to follow. Sarah hesitated. It was late, freezing, but something in Buddy's eyes unsettled her. He had never acted like this before. With a deep breath, she grabbed her coat and followed him into the night, the cold truth. The air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the yard. Buddy led Sarah through the backyard, his movements slow but determined. They reached the small, overgrown garden near the fence. Buddy stopped. He barked once, sharp and clear, before he began digging frantically at the earth. Clumps of dirt flew behind him, his nails scraping against something buried beneath. Sarah's stomach twisted. "Buddy, what are you doing?" She crouched beside him, brushing away the loosened soil with trembling hands. Something rough met her. Fingertips, wood, a box. Her breath caught in her throat, hands shaking. She pried it open. Inside lay an old, rusted key, a faded leather collar, and a note. The note was damp, the ink smudged, but she could still make out the words, "Sarah, you need to remember it wasn't an accident." Her blood ran cold. What wasn't an accident? She looked at Buddy, who whined softly, nudging the box. With his nose. And then, memories Sarah had buried deep inside began to surface. A past. She tried to forget. Sarah had lived in this house as a child years ago, but after her parents died in a tragic fire, she had left and never looked back. Everyone said it was an accident, a faulty wire, bad luck. But standing here, staring at the buried box, doubt crept into her heart. Was it really an accident? And why had Buddy, her childhood dog, her only remaining link to the past, been trying so hard to show her this? She swallowed hard, gripping the rusted key tightly. Buddy let out a low growl. His ears pricked up. Then she heard it, a rustling in the trees. They weren't alone. The shadow in the dark. Sarah's heart pounded as she turned toward the woods. The tall trees swayed, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The darkness between them was impenetrable. A single deliberate step echoed from the shadows. Someone was there. Buddy let out a warning growl, stepping protectively in front of Sarah. "Who's there?" she called out, though she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. Silence, then another step. Sarah's fingers dug into Buddy's fur. She could barely breathe. And then she saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It was tall, too tall. Then it stopped. For a moment the world stood still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then a voice, low, whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." Sarah's stomach dropped. Buddy barked furiously, his body rigid. Whoever was in the woods wasn't just watching. They were waiting. For what? The answer came when the front porch light, her only source of safety, flickered out. The house was now in complete darkness. Sarah ran. Buddy was right beside her, his paws pounding against the ground. Her lungs burned as she sprinted toward the house. She didn't dare look back. She fumbled with the doorknob, finally shoving it open and slamming it behind her. The lock clicked into place. Sarah pressed her back against the door, panting. Her hands shook as she reached for the box she had found. Buddy whined, pawing at the floor. The note, the key, the collar. What did it all mean? Sarah's mind raced. The rusted key. Where did it belong? She glanced at the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room, then it hit her. The basement. As a child, Sarah had been forbidden from going down there. She had always assumed it was just an old storage space. But what if— bang! A loud knock against the door made her jump. Buddy growled, his fur bristling. Someone was outside, and they weren't knocking to be polite, a door that should have stayed locked. With shaking hands, Sarah grabbed the old key and rushed toward the basement door. Buddy followed closely, his ears twitching at every sound. She hesitated for only a moment before jamming the key into the rusted lock. It turned with a reluctant click. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into pitch blackness. A cold draft slithered up from below. Sarah swallowed hard. She had to go down. The moment she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. Buddy let out a sharp bark. They were trapped. And in the suffocating darkness, something moved. Sarah reached for the light switch. It flickered, then sputtered. Out, her breath hitched. Then from the shadows a whisper, "You were never supposed to remember." Buddy barked furiously, lunging toward the voice. Sarah's scream lodged in her throat. Then a hand reached out from the dark, and everything went black. Who was in the basement? What secret had Sarah forgotten? And why had Buddy spent all these years trying to lead her back to this moment? Sarah was about to uncover the truth, but some truths are better left buried. The cold enveloped Sarah like a suffocating blanket. She blinked into the pitch-black basement, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The only sound was Buddy's low growl, rumbling like distant thunder. A whisper slid through the darkness. "You were never supposed to remember." Sarah's pulse hammered against her ribs. Who was speaking? Where were they? What had she forgotten? A sudden scuffling noise sent her heart into overdrive. A faint flickering light bulb sputtered to life, revealing the dust-covered basement, broken furniture, stacks of old books, and cobwebs clinging to forgotten corners filled the space. But what caught Sarah's attention was the far wall, a massive wooden cabinet that should not have been there. Buddy growled again, his ears flattened against his head. His gaze was fixed on the cabinet. Sarah stepped forward cautiously. The wood was warped, aged by time, and as she reached out, a splinter embedded itself in her finger. Wincing, she gripped the rusted handle and pulled. The cabinet groaned open, revealing a narrow passage leading deeper underground. A gust of stale air rushed out, carrying the scent of decay and something disturbingly familiar. Burnt wood. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. The fire. Her parents' deaths. No. The word was barely a whisper. Buddy nudged her leg, his warm fur grounding her. He stepped forward, his golden coat glowing faintly in the dim light. He had led her this far. He wanted her to go in, summoning every ounce of courage. Sarah stepped through the passage, the room of lost memories. The tunnel led to a small, hidden chamber. Dust motes swirled in the dim light from a single bare bulb swinging overhead. The walls were lined with faded newspaper clippings, all bearing one name, Sarah Whitmore. Her breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she reached for a headline. Local. Family perishes in tragic fire. Survivor Sarah Whitmore claims no memory of the event. The article was dated 20 years ago. A sickening chill spread through her. No memory, but she'd always remembered the fire, the nightmarish heat, the flames, consuming everything, the deafening crack of wood splitting. But suddenly, A different memory surfaced. The fire hadn't started from a faulty wire. It had started from a hand holding a match. Sarah staggered back, shaking her head. No, that wasn't right. That couldn't be true. She turned to Buddy, her voice barely audible. "Why are you showing me this?" Buddy let out a soft whimper, then trotted toward the far side of the chamber. There, half buried in dirt and old debris, lay a charred wooden box. Sarah hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside was a collection of items: an old locket, a child's drawing of a family, and a photograph. It was slightly burned around the edges, but the image remained clear. Sarah, as a child, standing between her parents. Behind them was a man she recognized, Uncle Richard. Sarah's stomach lurched. He had always been kind, always gentle, hadn't he? But suddenly she saw it, the way his eyes looked just slightly off, the way he had insisted she never talk about the fire, because he had been there that night. The man in the shadows, a slow clap, echoed through the chamber. Sarah whirled around, her heart slamming against her ribs. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the dim light. Uncle Richard. He hadn't aged well. His face was gaunt, his hair thinner, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "Sarah," he said smoothly, as if they were merely meeting for coffee, "you were supposed to forget." Buddy stood rigid beside her, his lips curled back in a silent snarl. You did it," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "You started the fire." Richard tilted his head. "I protected you." Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. "Protected me? You killed my parents," Richard sighed. "They were going to leave you. They were planning to disappear with you, take you far away. I couldn't let that happen. You were meant to stay here, with me." The room spun. "You're lying." "Am I?" Richard took a slow step forward. "Then why did you bury the memory? Why did you never question the way the town looked at you?" Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, but the memories clawed their way forward, the way people whispered behind her back, the way no one ever wanted to talk about the fire. The way Richard had always been there guiding her, ensuring she never left. He had shaped her whole life, based on a lie. Buddy suddenly lunged, snapping at Richard. He barely dodged in time. "Loyal to the end, aren't you?" Richard sneered, rubbing his arm where Buddy had nipped him. Sarah's fury boiled over. "Buddy knew all along, didn't he? He never forgot. That's why he brought me here. He was trying to show me the truth." Richard's expression darkened. "Then I suppose he's outlived his usefulness." He pulled a knife from his coat. Sarah barely had time to react. Richard lunged, but Buddy moved faster. The old golden retriever threw himself at the man, knocking him off balance. The knife clattered to the ground. "Buddy!" Sarah screamed. Richard roared in frustration, throwing Buddy off with a force that sent him yelping against the wall. Sarah saw red. She grabbed the rusted key, its edges jagged, and plunged it into Richard's shoulder. He let out a strangled cry, staggering back. Blood dripped from the wound. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed Buddy, hoisting him into her arms, and ran the last goodbye. Sarah burst through the basement door, her legs nearly giving out. She sprinted outside into the cold night, the sky breaking into dawn. She didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house. By the time the police arrived, Richard was gone. Vanished. But the truth was finally out. Sarah gave her statement. The buried evidence was uncovered. Her parents' case was reopened, but none of that mattered in that moment. Right now, only Buddy mattered. She cradled him in her arms as the sun rose. His breathing was labored, his body weak. "You saved me," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You were always protecting me, weren't you?" Buddy's eyes softened. He let out a small sigh, nuzzling into her one last time. And then he closed his eyes. Sarah's sobs broke the morning silence. Buddy had kept his final promise. He had made sure she remembered. And now he could rest. The final message Sarah never stopped looking for. Richard. But in her heart she knew one thing. Buddy had saved her, and some guardian angels have fur and 4 legs.